So just want to thank the DMN for sponsoring this and allowing us this stage, and especially to the University of Texas at Arlington's College of Architecture, Planning, and Public Affairs, of which I am a part, which is a co-sponsor for this event. This event comes out of, or sort of the next iteration of our David Dillon Symposium, and it's a product of the school's David Dillon Center for Research of Texas Architecture. David Dillon was my predecessor as architecture critic at the DMN. Our last symposium last year was on architecture and justice in the wake of Ferguson. So we solved that. So we can move on. This year's theme, the subject of work, which, with the exception of maybe the new housewives of Dallas County, is something that's really important to all of us, especially in a city like Dallas, which is so driven by corporate culture. I think the way we work is so important, and it's changing so rapidly, and it affects all of our lives, where we live, the way we live, how we live during the day, both in our offices and at home. So it's really exciting, I think, to talk about such an important subject for the city. And I guess we've assembled a pretty great panel to talk about this subject. I should say that you're part of this panel informally, and once we're done with this initial 60-minute discussion, we're going to have questions from you. So I hope you'll be thinking about how your own participation in this conversation, because I think that's really important for the city, is generating that kind of conversation. So we'll have time for your questions, and please be thinking about them. So with not much more further ado, I'll try and keep my talking to a limit and introduce my panelists here. I have next to me Nikil Saval, who was our keynote speaker last night, the editor at the magazine N+1 and the author of Curbed, A Secret History of the Office. Adjacent to him is Kate Canales. She's the Director of Design and Innovation at SMU's Lyle School of Engineering. Adjacent again, Inga Saffron, the Pulitzer Prize-winning architecture critic of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Pierre Chacko, the Director of Urban Design for the city of Dallas, so all problems are his fault. Finally, but not least, Ron Stelmarski, the Chief Design Director for the Texas office of the architecture firm Perkins+Will, wonderful architecture firm. So we're, I think, blessed to have them all with us. Blessed, but anyway. So I guess we'll start with Nikil, and I guess your big idea from last night. And if I correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what it was, I interpreted it to be that we reconceive the notion between the office and the city. And I was wondering maybe if you could unpack what you meant by that a little bit.
Sure. What I was trying to get at with my presentation was to sort of figure out, the future of the office based on where it's come from historically and what the office's relationship with the city has been and how it might change. So one of the things I talked about, or I was interested in, was how the office was always associated in American cities usually with downtowns, how it concentrated, and how it sprung up and grew into skyscrapers and then also into suburban offices. And how, in a way, even though offices were dependent on cities or really implicated in them, the permeability between the office building, between offices themselves and the city itself had become less and less. The barriers had become much stronger. This was at the same time that we had this other development that was constantly threatening to erode this barrier, which was, on the one hand, the rise of technology that permitted sort of more mobile kinds of working. And on the other end, I actually didn't really get into this too much last night, was the change in the nature of employment. maybe we can talk about that later, that employment is becoming much more flexible, you might say precarious. The number of sort of freelancers or independent contractors in the workforce is growing. So you have a much more sort of like a kind of reserve army of workers that are not tied to one sort of office. And so I wanted to look at examples of workplaces, and a lot of them were co-working spaces, but things that were like that showed how the office building, the office itself didn't necessarily have a monopoly on office work, and how the city could somehow be let in to the office space, and the office itself could be expanded out to the city as well. So this is a development that, I mean, it's a proposal, but it's actually something that I think is just already happening, that we already see taking place in our daily lives, and I wanted to tease out the implications.
Inga, actually this idea of co-working, I know it's something you've written about a lot, and I wonder if you might talk about some of the more innovative spaces you've seen, co-working spaces, especially a place called Panelist in Philadelphia. Maybe you could explain a little bit what that is and how it works, and what you think, how it might be a successful model, and maybe also some of the problems with it. It's not some of its troubles, shall we say. Good.
Okay.
Audio.
Yeah, sure. So I can talk a little bit about the co-working that's evolved in Philadelphia, and there's been a tremendous variety of co-working spaces, small, privately owned co-working spaces in old Class B office buildings. Some WeWork has now established a beachhead in Philadelphia. That's a more corporately owned, large-scale co-working space. And then the one that Mark referred to, the Pennovation, is at the University of Pennsylvania, and that's quite interesting because in the 60s, Penn, which is the really big university, and Drexel, another large university, established what they call a science center, which was meant to be incubators for startups. But it turned out that the rents were super expensive, and people were actually not, going there to work or start businesses. And so Penn decided to buy an old DuPont campus a little bit outside of the downtown, and establish a less expensive co-working spaces for small startups, for people mainly connected with the universities. And that's not quite open yet, but what we see in this whole, there's like a space for everybody, every kind of work, whether you're, a sole practitioner lawyer who just needs a desk, or a freelance writer who only wants to have an office a couple days a week. All sorts of people are gravitating to this. They're gravitating to it not just because they need a place to work, but for social reasons. That's a huge part of it. WeWork really sells itself on all the sort of after-party stuff that they offer. And so it's interesting to watch how the co-working is taking over a larger and larger percentage of the office market.
I thought Inga and Nikil made this rather ironic point last night that we used to, go to the office to get paid, and now we pay to go to the office. It's interesting the way that the two have infiltrated each other. Pierre, maybe you could speak a little bit about the co-working revolution and how Dallas, the city, is planning for it.
Some of you may be surprised to know that Dallas does have quite a few co-working spaces already, and they're cropping up in some of the parts of town where you would expect them to, the downtown central area and Bishop Arts. But more surprisingly, it's also happening in some of our more suburban parts of the city as well. So to me, that's a clear sign that it's at least an emerging trend, if not one that's established in Dallas. I'm the bureaucrat on this panel, so I'm going to take a little bit more of a bureaucratic approach to it. But I deal, I've worked for the city for about 16 years, and a big part of that has been dealing with the concept of zoning, which those of you who are not familiar with the term, and I've met quite a few people who are not, it's basically a term that's about, it's about a little over 100 years, and it's based on the notion of putting uses into little packets that typically don't interact with each other. And it's based on the notion that interaction between uses create impacts, typically negative impacts, and therefore they should be avoided. But increasingly we've realized what I think many of people who've lived in our planet for a long time, that it's very hard to put uses in little boxes. And so we're very much now in an era where the notion of trying to separate uses is something that should actually be the exception rather than the rule. We've been wrestling in Dallas. We're certainly not the first one off the block with trying to encourage more mixing of uses. The good thing is that there are a number of parts of town where, not intentionally, but more or less by mistake, I guess, we've tended to allow all kinds of uses like this to occur. So most of these co-working spaces have been happening organically. But we are definitely working towards trying to encourage more of this mixing of uses. And this idea that that interaction between uses can be mostly a positive thing, that you can much more narrowly identify marginal negative impacts and deal with them with a lighter touch. And that ultimately we can, in many respects, the economy that we're in is actually one that is completely at odds with the economy that was the reason why zoning was invented. When we had obnoxious industrial uses in the middle of the city, and so the notion of trying to separate them was more important. I think Nikil mentioned yesterday the idea of, it's not just the idea of offices happening in different formats, but also a broader sense of what work in the city means. The idea of making things is something that happens in less impactful ways nowadays. You don't have as many obnoxious industrial uses, and the idea that more of that is going to happen in different parts of the city.
Artisanal industry.
Yes.
Ron, you are designing these spaces. I'm wondering maybe if you could talk about how this idea of co-working is changing the way your clients are talking to you about designing office space, and also about how you're talking to your clients about those kinds of design. Yeah. And I think one of the interesting things Nikil brought up yesterday was some examples of companies that were actually opening their offices to the city. I was like, how do you even begin to convince a client to do that?
Well, that's a good question, because I would say that a big part of what we're seeing is just that notion of indeterminacy. No one really knows the kinds of questions we're trying to answer. We're all trying to be in position to answer the question. So for example, we talk about the maker spaces. We talk about the sort of fragmenting of sort of the monoculture. So all this mixing, all these ideas about how we can incubate great ideas are finding their way into the physical environment. I mean, I just read a fact, I think it said something like 65% of the grade school kids today, the jobs they'll hold when they're adults have not even been invented yet. And so I'm not sure even what that means, but the reality is there is a huge notion about creativity. What Kate's doing, same thing. We're designing higher education buildings that allow for the maker spaces, the incubator spaces to occur. And buildings are in some ways programmatically becoming more and more generic because they want to be lofts. Just like Nikil pointed out, people will go in and inhabit old warehouse buildings because they're such great spaces. Strong bones, high ceilings, usually high base spaces, and great natural light. And so we're starting to show case studies to clients about how they can engage the city and the importance and relevance of where they inhabit. Because the reality is, most clients these days come to us without a full program. It used to be they would give you a program and here it is, rooms, sizes, number of people. Now they say we've got these many dollars, we think we can build this much square feet, and we're trying to achieve a certain number of things. How do we do it? And it is up to us to help define that mix. So when we look at those areas and the kinds of things that help to inform that decision making, we hope we're not too late. Often I'm sitting right between where Kate's educating the new workforce, we've got Pierre who's helping shape the city policy and ways of developing, but a client may come and just give us a site to work with. And that's when we have to really sort of avert any decisions that might not be to the advantage of the client. So the best client is going to be someone who probably is the investor as well as the user. And that's a lot of things we're seeing right now. If you have an investor bias in a design of a building, you're usually designing for the lease life of the building and not the full 30, 50, 100-year life of the building. And so it's just coming to grips with all of that and how we as designers can show that sort of full circuit from K-12 education, higher education, workplace, and then how that all folds back on itself to inform one another.
Okay, we're talking about the way people actually use these spaces. That's really, maybe you can help us work through that a little. And when we were talking the other day, you brought up the water cooler, which you described as an object which isn't really about itself. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what you meant and what the implications for that are on the office and office design.
Right, it's not really a water cooler. Because of all the things that we say about water coolers, it's a metaphor, but it also is sometimes literally a place that you go and you end up colliding. And Nikil talked about this phenomenon of serendipity happening, and the water cooler is a great symbol for serendipity in the workplace. I think the way that I look at it, traditionally as a product designer, is what are the behaviors that a physical object or a physical space either enables or insists upon, and what values do the physical objects and the spaces say about us. So these chairs on this stage in this room are sending all kinds of messages. Some of them are ergonomic, right? Traditionally in product design, we would look at the ergonomics. So these chairs are causing us to sit in a certain way, which may be very natural or maybe not. And then that posture that we're assuming, either we're kind of fighting very consciously to overcome the posture that the chair is forcing upon us, or not. And then that impacts how we are in symphony or not with each other. So right now I kind of have my back to Inga, and is she taking that personally? She might be. It's not personal, but you know, and we don't mean that, and nobody who chose these chairs intended for us to have it out over the fact that, but there are all these intended and unintended things that happen with the artifacts that we live with in these spaces, and then the fact that they're kind of we're not really talking to each other, we're really talking to you, but they're sort of in an arc and to imply that we're kind of in this conversation and you're watching, and then we're in this huge room on this stage which sets us up as sort of the generators, and you all are the receivers of this panel, which I think is fine. I think that's by design. This may be a good reflection of a design that is delivering on its intention, but we have a lot of things, especially in the workplace, and actually it extends to other institutionalized physical spaces really easy, like classrooms and hospitals, and those places where the physical environment is causing us to behave in ways that are unintended. And that gets really interesting when you want the behavior to change, but you're not willing to invest in the physical space.
Inga. Sorry, I'm not going to go in just around in an order equally, because that would be boring. People would predict what's going to happen, and we need to keep them on their toes. You wrote about Glaxo's new offices that they are a social disruptor that promises to shake up the way we work as well as our cities. Maybe you could tell us how and whether you still think that's true.
So I wrote a piece about a big pharmaceutical company in Philadelphia, GlaxoSmithKline, which had for many years occupied, you know, a legacy downtown office building. And well, there's a sad part of the story. It was originally a Philadelphia company. It was bought by a British company. They were, you know, unsure. Did they want to like keep this North American headquarters in Philadelphia? Or did they want to get rid of it? So in the end, they said, we're not going to renew our lease in the Legacy Tower, but we are going to stay in Philadelphia, but we're going to, you know, reinvent our corporate culture by having a different kind of space. When they were in the Legacy Tower, you know, like, you know, sort of Mad Men era towers, you know, It was 50 floors. People would go up and down to different departments in the elevator. They built a 4-story building in our Navy Yard, which is sort of on the edge of downtown. And the way they did it, nobody has an assigned desk at all. In fact, there aren't really any desks there. But there's and I think this is a big trend in workplace design. There's a whole range of workspaces for every person, every mood, every situation. So when you walk in, there's like a hotel lobby with comfy chairs and tables. You can work there if you want. There are rooms with large group tables for teamwork. There are cafes. There are some little rooms with doors where you can make a phone call or do quiet work, or you can leave the building because it's in this sort of green campus. So there's a workplace to suit every need, and not only don't people have any private space, all they get is a little cubby with a key that they can lock their stuff in. But even the president of the company doesn't have an office. There are no closed offices except for these little private workrooms to write something or to speak on the telephone. But so you'll walk into the lobby, which is just like walking into a hotel lobby, and there will be the president of the company working on her laptop or having a small meeting. They set up a lot of sort of social spaces on the ground floor. There's a restaurant, there's a Genius Bar, sort of mimicking Apple's Genius Bar. There's a gym. There's a rooftop garden where you can sit outside and look out on the remaining ships in the Navy Yard. It's sort of like they created this kind of fun place, but very unstructured place. And I think it was very difficult at first for people to adjust. But the idea behind it was that, first of all, it would allow people to work more as teams and not to be in one fixed location every single day of the week. To have serendipitous interactions with their colleagues where maybe they would say, what are you working on? What are you working on? And they would share ideas. So by completely changing the space, they would change the way they generated ideas, the way they produced products, and they would become more, their feeling was that they would become more reactive and spontaneous about the creation of the products that they produce and how they market them.
Ron, you've designed, maybe you could talk a little bit about this. A lot of this sounds familiar from your Richards office building up 75. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of that's a very innovative design, I think, in a lot of ways. And maybe you could talk a little about some of the ideas, both similar and different in that project.
Okay, sure. Yeah, a lot of ideas never seem like they're brand new. It's how the different ideas come together into a single structure, like the Richards Group. So for Stan Richards, those who don't know, he's really sort of a staple in Dallas, brand and advertising. He's got a school named after him now down at UT Austin. But there, we were taking his culture and bringing it over to a new building. We weren't trying to invent a culture. So he uses the word egalitarian, and I think the word egalitarian could almost be taken so far that it becomes authoritarian. But at the same time, he wants everything to be to a point where everyone starts at the same level, and there's not going to be a discussion about differentiation. So I think in contrast to what Inga is saying, he wanted to create as much mixing spaces, as much of a heart to the building, but allow everyone else to have the home base be the same. And so there are no doors in that office. Certainly the bathrooms and storage closets, but no one has an office with a door or a lock except for the CFO. And that was a big thing to really take into account. We also organized the building straight off by taking the elevator core, service equipment, stairs, and so forth, pulling them to the edge of the building. And that was not an architectural decision. It helped to certainly block the sun on the west side, which is the hot side of the building. But what it did for him was allowed there to be a 4-story atrium inside the building, which is something they had in their previous location, but was much smaller. So we sort of turned up the volume and gave him a space where at any given time he can get on the PA and say, all staff meeting or stairwell meeting. Everyone, all 700 people come to the stairwell. It's organized almost like a three-dimensional sort of amphitheater in space. They occupy the balconies and the stairs, and he makes the announcement. So either introducing someone, talking about a new win, whatever the news is, it's always about people seeing people and having the sight lines. Sight lines are important, and they maintain that sort of cultural aspect. Stan was really keen on transparency, and so transparency and the Texas heat don't seem to quite align. So we adhere to that philosophy of transparency and openness because it really does give people the chance inside to just get sweeping views of the city from dusk to dawn. It gives you a really good barometer of what's happening in the city. You see storms roll in, you see the sun rise and set, but he's someone who really wanted to create an idea and did not want the practical issues of architecture and development to get in the way. And that's what I was talking about earlier. That's when you have the investor and the user. But for him, just saying hi to each other is an important piece. And so the serendipitous thing for sure, but he didn't want to overly stimulate the building to be the city. He wanted to give the top floor over to a fitness level. And really the only reason I think he did that was because he didn't want the top floor to be for anyone. He wanted the top floor to be for everyone. So by chopping out the top floor and making it a mixing zone, you essentially have taken away a lot of the hierarchy. I mean, Stan sits at the bottom of a stairwell. There's a large stairwell in space in the atrium. You come down and Stan's office is right there. So if you trip and fall, you probably land in his lap. But the reality is he's there mixing with the staff day in, day out. I think those are important moves because these are not things that we've not seen before, but the way it was used to adapt to his culture in West Village, he brought 700 people to an environment where they all go out and they have lunch and they use the different amenities around the site. Public transportation became much easier for them to use. And overall, it became, a really a signboard for how you could do commercial development without having to always follow these formulaic rules.
Nikil.
Can I just add one thing? I should have said this. One of the interesting things about this kind of office design is that it's a lot denser than the old legacy office towers. And when SmithKline moved from its tower in the very center of downtown to the Navy Yard, they put the same number of people in a quarter of the space. So it's sort of like in a city, when you start bringing everyone into the downtown and increase the density, you increase the opportunity for social interactions. And that was the same idea behind the downsizing of this space, is just everyone is a lot closer together. And at first it was, I think, very difficult for people to not have as much private space. They didn't have their defined cubicle. And they had to adjust to being in closer proximity. But the idea was that there were creative benefits from having a greater number of interactions.
So it's funny because I visited GlaxoSmithKline as well, but I guess there are two Philadelphians and 4 Dallasites on this panel. So I visited a number of offices like it, and one of the things that I wonder about is whether, I understand that the idea is that openness and brings collaboration, it brings creative benefits. I'm not sure that we ever actually know whether they do. And my experience is often that the empirical justification for a lot of these kinds of new office developments is actually quite limited, and actually sometimes runs against the things that we're trying to engineer in the offices. This speaks to the notion of unintended consequences in design. In GlaxoSmithKline, the most notable thing that I saw was the fact that they had very few private spaces, and those spaces were occupied all the time. And they actually they were so overoccupied and so in demand that they actually had to limit the number of hours that people could spend in them. And this was just because of the fact that people were actually terrified. This is my interpretation. Terrified of these open office spaces that, which I will also point out are deathly quiet. They're not buzzing with conversation. They're just people who have headphones on constantly, because headphones are the new walls. They can't. And then studies of open office. This is a big debate among office people who watch this stuff. Those plans, they may not encourage collaboration. People tend to hate them. A pretty representative study from the Journal of Environmental Psychology from 2013 suggested that nearly half of people who worked in open office plans hated them. People who worked in cubicles hated them slightly more. Cubicles and open office plans are not actually that different. The sound, in a way, they're actually quite similar in their effects on acoustical privacy and things like that. I mean, and one thing that you noticed is that when they did study people who'd had private offices, this same study suggested that they didn't actually have trouble interacting with their employees. So I wonder if what's happening is we have people who have ideas about transparency and openness and clarity, and these are just symbolic. They're registered purely symbolically in the space. And then what happens is you have people who then are completely blindsided by what actually happens. Do we know if they're more productive? Productivity is impossible to measure in offices. It's like you can measure in call center spaces. You can measure how many calls people make. Incidentally, they're better made at home. That's the one not in an office. That's one that's been confirmed by various studies. So, I mean, I just wonder, self-reported productivity is not an adequate measure. I just wonder to what extent when we talk about these future ideas, to what extent they're valuable, that they're being based on real knowledge. Anyway.
The one thing I'd respond to in terms of that kind of commentary is, that's a very inside working out type of mentality. And we can fall into a trap of thinking that we only define the architecture by the inside out. And I think the largest single design problem facing the world today is resiliency. I mean, hands down, we can say it might become a buzzword, but between food, structure, shelter, climate, if we were to take your sort of big idea from last night and think about co-working and how we engage with the city, I would really suggest we think about this resilient district. I mean, let's not build on areas that we already have in place. I think that's sometimes a fallacy in a city. Let's take either, say, a Deep Ellum or an Uptown or Bishop Arts, and let's keep reinforcing those. Well, why don't we pull back and say, where is the best place to build based on climate projections, affordability, and really think differently about a new area? Because working from the outside in, because I agree, we can debate open office, closed office. I don't know that there is a single answer, and typically we build in choice. So choice is really what happens. I like the fact that we did an open office because it's so resilient. People can come, they can build walls in the future. There's nothing that's going to impair if they want to close things down. But again, that's something that can be almost an organic development of how people want to inhabit space. If you come in with cubes, you're isolated. You come in with nothing, even if it's just a bench, you have a chance to then form a space and think about how you'd like to work. But at the end of the day, I think the resilient piece and creating a district that is about something that Dallas wants to be is where the co-working, all that would happen.
Ron, I think you raise a really, really important question, which is affordability and the way workspaces shape the entire city. An important study, I think, published this week, actually by a researcher at UTA, showing that affordable housing, FHA affordable housing, is actually not affordable in automotive cities because the costs of transportation, especially a car, jack up the actual costs of living so that the affordable housing, which is supposed to be 30% of income, actually is much higher, a higher percentage for those in automotive cities who have much longer to travel, they have to use a car, et cetera. So the question is, how do we, and I'll put this to you, Pierre, how can you fix this tomorrow? How do we make a city that's, where work is more accessible to more people and do it without, building more highways?
This is really a major and very timely issue for Dallas right now. I'm guessing most of the folks in the audience are probably from Dallas, and so you probably remember on the occasional day in Dallas when you have the temperatures go below zero and there's a freeze and DART tends to shut down. It's amazing. Most people don't really think about it because they're not often affected by it, but there are a significant population in Dallas that have it's a very disruptive event in their lives, who usually have to make not just one one transit trip, but typically more than one connected transit trip in order to get to work on any given day. And so it's a very significant problem that I'm glad you pointed out is closely related to housing, and it's closely related to the fact that as a city and as a region, we have jobs and housing mostly very separated from each other physically, and involve significant daily trips and a significant expenditure that a lot of people can't afford. So in Dallas, this is something that politically is very, very difficult to wrestle with, and is not something that cities usually do voluntarily. It so happens that right now, there's nothing like a good crisis to get everybody's attention. Dallas has been under the gun somewhat by the Department of Housing and Urban Development with regard to our affordable housing policy. And so we are right now wrestling with the notion of trying to develop a affordable housing policy that looks seriously at this issue, not only about how we encourage more affordable housing in the right places, but we're looking at it from across the income spectrum, not just the lowest end of the income spectrum, but across the income spectrum in terms of how much people have to pay as a percentage of their income. And also looking very closely at the idea of really departing from our historical pattern of concentrating poverty in parts of town and creating blight. A very big part of that, as your question suggested, has to do with transportation and access. We are, I think, very fortunate in Texas as being a city that has, with amazing forethought, actually invested in a light rail transit system. A very amazing thing, given that we are not a dense city, not one that lends itself to transit. But over the last 20 years, we've actually invested in that system, and it's an amazing piece of infrastructure to take advantage of. The way we build and we continue to develop our city can be hopefully informed by that, that development patterns can occur in a way that reduces dependency on automobiles rather than increasing that. And so that's something that we're very focused on, not only in terms of developing our affordable housing policy, but also in terms of really looking at how mobility takes place in the city, looking at how we look as our central city develops, as people are returning to the city and wanting to live here, as we've seen over the last 10 years, really looking to understand the demand for shorter trips that do not have to be dependent on automobiles, and how we can serve those kinds of trips better so that people have choices.
Well, in listening to the other city panels, I think they all try to kind of want to be the physical city. The literary city, Alma Guillermo Prieto, one of her chief visions was that a literary city is a walking city. And then earlier today we heard the healthy city, and the healthy city we learned is a walking city. Everybody wants to be the physical city because we're the best. And I think, we're also here talking about the city and the office, transportation, and of course the best means of urban transportation isn't an automobile or even a train, it's your feet. So yet we don't live in a pedestrian-friendly city. So I'm just actually wondering what the impressions of our visitors are coming into Dallas from Philadelphia, which has its own issues in that direction, and looking at this city. Either of you like to comment about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm hesitant to. I mean, so Inga and I actually went on a long walk today. We were, I think, one of maybe 4 people walking on the walk that we. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but it was not many people walking from uptown through the Arts District, actually through Clyde Warren Park, and then the Arts District, and then through downtown to Dealey Plaza, and then we walked back. And actually, my experience of that walk was, I mean, except for occasional ducking under overpasses and some areas where I was not, it was not especially, the sidewalks would disappear. It was a fairly pleasant walk. I mean, the thing that was missing was especially when I was in downtown, when I felt that there was the lack of density and the fact that there was very little retail on the bottom floors, or that you were traversing walking along giant parking lots or sheer walls, made the experience of that walk feel much longer than it actually was. And so in a way, when I felt like there's actually, and then when we walked through Clyde Warren Park, which is extraordinary, I think, is like, and I, in some ways, we were expressing a lot of envy for what the city had done to cap this freeway. I mean, then you suddenly felt like parts of the city were coming together, and there was this real sense of connection that was being expressed through that walk. And so I thought, in a way, in a weird way, once you experience things like that, you suddenly feel like I'm not to be Pollyanna-ish about this, but there are clear things that can be done to mitigate the sense of anomie and just gigantism that comes from walking in a not pedestrian-unfriendly city. I don't know if Inga.
Yeah, I've felt the same way. I mean, it's really interesting how there's moments of like real urbanism where the sidewalks are very generous and the streets are designed in a way that you don't feel oppressed by the traffic, and there's shade trees, and maybe there's something going on the ground floor, and then suddenly that ends. And then you're confronted with some incredibly wide highway that's impossible to cross and no sidewalks. The reason we were envying Clyde Warren so much, I mean, I think it is just a great intervention that sutures up these disconnected parts of the city. We're staying in Uptown, so we just flowed right through to the Arts District and into downtown. And it seems like there's so many points, that you need a lot of discrete interventions to improve certain points where that comfortable urbanism disappears, and you need density of people, and you need this kind of activity that, it's like when you're reading a novel and there's a plot twist, and that keeps you going to the next part of the novel, and then something else happens and that moves you along, and you need those plot twists in the city to keep you going through the city. We were very motivated, but if you didn't have that motivation, you're not inclined to walk.
Pierre, I'm sorry. Oh, Kate, please.
Well, I was going to jump in to see if there's a notion here about the campus, which is something that I think I wanted to kind of inspect. So you brought up something last night that was about these workplaces that are sort of designed to keep you there as long as possible. We'll do your dry cleaning, we'll change your oil, we'll feed you dinner. And they've become cities in and of themselves. And I think a campus, and I work on a campus every day, has kind of been designed for a much longer period of time to do the same thing, to self-contain. But it's highly walkable. There are days on campus when I walk quite a bit. You park at the edge of campus and then you walk between the things that you need to do. But then at the same time, it doesn't provide this porousness or permeability to the city. And I just find it very, very interesting tension in that it's walkable, it has a lot of the features that we say we want in a city, but it isn't a city. It doesn't feel of the city at all, in a way.
Actually, thanks for adding that to the mix, Kate, because I think it's an interesting sort of add-on to what Inga had said, as well as you did, Nikil, earlier on. One of the really interesting and challenging things about cities in general, and I particularly know about it in Dallas, is how complex the urban environment is when you look at the street, and how amazingly difficult it is to actually change an environment like that over a period of time. And sort of an interesting aspect to that is this notion of a campus, which is typically controlled by one entity that you can master plan, and it has an edge. And it's typically a controlled edge. And it's typically something where if it's privately owned, there's usually a gate there, and entry and exit is managed. Now, when you look at a typical street along the path that Nikil and Inga, you walked along today, everywhere along that street, you're usually not aware of it, but there's somewhere there's a hidden line that marks where public property ends and private property begins. And the whole act of actually trying to change that environment takes an incredibly complicated process of public and private interaction that happens one project at a time. Usually public works projects that the city controls happen within the public right-of-way. They are usually defined by a public works program that's planned over a period of 5 years. And then you have individual private projects that occur in a totally uncoordinated way when they are needed at particular points in time. And they usually are never occurring at the same time that a public works project is occurring. And so this sort of this incremental pattern that occurs is a huge factor in how this city evolves. And so one of the challenges that we try to deal with in this whole process is trying to coordinate better, because it's inevitable that these changes will never happen at the same time. But trying to figure out a way in which we can create a framework where everybody's sort of playing to the same, I guess to the same sort of a composition, if you will, if you put it in musical terms. And so one of the things that we're trying to do right now, and some of you may have attended a brief conversation we had just prior to this panel about trying to develop some urban design principles in the city of Dallas that acknowledges the fact that these are never going to be master planned solutions, that they are essentially solutions that have different parties working usually separately from each other. But it would be great if we can have an overall game plan where people are essentially trying to encourage a public realm that encourages walking in this case, that enables buildings that are on private property to engage the street in a way that actually encourages people to feel comfortable walking by as opposed to turning their back to it, as well as ensuring that there's an attention to simple details like shading devices and planting trees and landscaping and things like that that just help contribute to the pedestrian environment.
Nikil, when we were talking about this talk, initially you had thought about maybe doing a titled Against Skyscrapers. My response is, why do you hate America? But I think you had a lovely description of them yesterday as stacked cubicles, just stacks of cubicles, and an idea about cities now should be thinking horizontally rather than vertically. And maybe you could describe what it is about the skyscraper that is problematic, shall we say?
Yeah, I'm actually glad you saved me from just ranting against skyscrapers, but I have an opportunity to do that now. My feeling, and it's really, I actually quite admire like certain skyscrapers, and we have one in Philadelphia that is a great one by William Lescaze, and Howe is the other architect, right?
Howe and Lescaze.
Yeah. And
William
Howe
Lescaze, architect of the Magnolia Lounge, actually. So we share that with Philadelphia.
Right. Great building. And so there are so many examples of great skyscraper architecture. I mean, the thing that has sort of, that was interesting to me about the skyscraper is because I investigated it historically just to figure out why are offices in skyscrapers? Why are the buildings so tall? Like, I wanted to ask a lot of naive, dumb questions about it, and see if I could come up with an answer that wasn't, well, we need them because we need this. That's how it's an efficient use of space. Because many cities that are dense and have a lot of office work actually in them don't have skyscrapers. These tend to be European cities, and they in turn are not without problems. They developed other kinds of ways of preserving their historic core. So Paris, for example, doesn't have skyscrapers in the center of the city for the large part, but they do have La Défense on the edge of the city, which is or London has built Canary Wharf, in addition to some skyscrapers in the city of London. But largely they're low-rise cities. Why did American cities build skyscrapers? And I feel like, you know, the answer is very complicated, partly that cities don't have those historic cores like European cities, but one of them is that is simply real estate speculation. That I felt that when you looked at office towers, you didn't have to, the fact that some of them were neo-Gothic, and like the Woolworth Tower in New York, or, you know, when you think about skyscraper theory, and you think about some of the kind of the late 19th century, early 20th century skyscrapers built by Louis Sullivan, for example, which are we now think of as quite beautiful. You know, a lot of them, or at least from the skyscrapers that imitated these, were simply speculative, and they were not built because they necessarily were in demand, but they were predicated on future demand. Some of them were built to lure tenants from other skyscrapers. So in a way, they were just, they're someone, I think it's Cass Gilbert, the architect of the Woolworth Tower, called them buildings that make the land pay. So that was one of the reasons that I felt like we should think about ways in which these are somewhat arbitrary phenomena. They weren't necessary. We didn't actually have to build skyscrapers. They didn't all have to be concentrated in downtowns. We can think of, nor is it absolutely necessary that we think that a sign of a city's kind of health is like in East Asian cities, for example, is the fact that they have all these skyscrapers. There may be other ways to think about building. The other thing that I think we should think about or maybe interrogate is whether it's the most efficient use of space. And I think this is where the fact that we have a little more data on how space is used, but not actually that much more, ought to give us a clue into whether we want to build buildings like this that are that tall and that high, and whose financial, you know, whose sort of reasons for being are not totally clear. So, for example, one of the statistics I cited yesterday by this architecture firm, DEGW, suggested that people were at their desks in a typical office day 42% of the time. And so it's not easy to then figure out what you do with that statistic, but it does suggest that people are not, like, to have permanently dedicated office space and to have buildings dedicated entirely to offices may not be, and to have these buildings be immensely tall and crowded in a central area, may not be the best use of space. It may not be the most efficient use. It may not be the most sustainable use. And I don't think there's like a clear solution that it's not just that you build low-rise, dense cities. I don't know that that's, I mean, especially listening to planners and architects speak about this, these solutions are not easy to come by. But these are that's one of the reasons I think I wanted to kind of think about the skyscraper and think about it less as a natural phenomena, or the natural way that offices had to be.
Ron, as the architect here, I will put you on the spot, I'm a fan of skyscrapers. I love them as a medium, and where appropriate. My question is, why are so many of them in Dallas awful? Why aren't we building better? Why aren't we building better buildings? I mean, it's just a standard glass, block. Yeah. And now that they all have argon lighting around them, right, lighting up like hot dog stands. So what is going on?
Well, that is a good question. I mean, that's one thing we look at. We gauge our cities, like Nikil's saying, by the skyline in the ways we try to dress it up and articulate it. The architecture here, I mean, some of it just becomes overly derivative of what the economics are saying. Again, I think I've talked about this before, where lease depths are given to us now. They want there to be a certain lease depth. They want a certain number of square foot per floor. And at that point, you've sort of created an envelope that is sort of maximized. So that the numbers work, and it seems to be homogeneous. It'll work for almost every type of tenant. And from there, the extrusion happens. And if you try to make some offsets or do some other kind of cladding of the skin, it becomes a cost proposition. And so there is a certain resistance. I mean, it's a dollar versus time versus expectation. I think there's also, it's personal taste. I mean, there is some level of taste where some of the towers are actually quite beautiful, I think, in Dallas. Some of them, not so much. But the reality is there's a lot of forces that don't allow for an architecture that exceeds efficiency. And how do you do that? And how do you...
What can we do what are some of the things we can do to make better buildings?
Well, going back to what Nikil was saying earlier, and even last night, if we start to think about the performance of the building as a whole, outside of its own limits, so we start talking about the resilient district. We start to break things down and put them in the blender a bit and give them articulation. People love to get up in a tower and see things. So I think in terms of a tower, spiritually and just they've got something really important. I mean, think of the old towns when they built the cathedrals. Those were overwhelming, but they were at the same time awe-inspiring. So I think there's opportunity for the vertical nature of things to really give us something unique and different, but it shouldn't be about economics only. And it should be about how we take the architectural idea and add more to it. I mean, all the mixing, the co-working, if we bring more forces to the architecture, you're going to find more variance in the architecture. If the bottom line is only the dollar, you won't get anything different than the box. If you start to think about the value that might come from either just climate reaction or other forms of social enterprise that could happen, that itself will start to really break down the building. I mean, it could become much more of a horizontal idea. I mean, we think about linked hybrids that Stephen Hall did, where you have sort of streets in the air, which again goes back to the Unité with Corbu and starts to open up questions about the ground plane. So there's a lot of issues once you go vertical, how do you break that down? But at the same time, there is opportunity for architecture to react to other things besides the dollar.
I'd like to add something on that, less to do with the look of towers and tall buildings, but just an interesting point about a lot of when you look at the density that's associated with towers, a lot of people don't think about this, but you can take the same density that you accomplish on individual sites with towers and actually accomplish the same degree of density in a much more horizontal fashion that usually lends itself to a much more engaging public realm and environment. And that's something that is usually a result of the way the real estate market works, with any one property owner wanting to maximize the development they can on just that one piece of property. Zoning, which I deal with a lot, often plays into that. We have vastly overzoned large parts of the city, and that's something that's very hard to take away once you've given it away. And so that's something that has a big influence. Personally, I don't think we have to worry a great deal about a lot more towers being built in Dallas. I really don't think. I mean, there will be more, but I don't think we need to worry about it being about future huge problems of tower concentrations. But one quick point about towers and the design of towers, though, one of my biggest complaints about towers is not what they look like from a distance, but how they engage the street. And there are very few towers in Dallas that do a good job of that.
Yes, it's always the parking podium, which is a disaster. So we're going to start taking questions in a couple of minutes. So if folks would like to line up at the microphones here if you have questions for our panel. I'll add maybe just a couple of quick ones here. I guess we'll put you guys on a 30-second time. Inga, I wanted to ask you one last question. You wrote recently about the office of Kieran Timberlake, wonderful architecture firm that I like very much. I know you too. And they have a really interesting office. They don't have air conditioning. I don't think you could get away with that in Dallas, but maybe you could talk a little bit about, or tell us a little bit about their office and what is so unique about it.
So this is an architecture firm in Philadelphia that has really focused on sustainability, designing buildings that are sustainable over the long term, and their other focus is on innovation and testing. You know, architects, every building is a custom product. And even though, you know, architects develop a body of knowledge and they sort of know what works, it's like, it's always like the first time. And so Kieran Timberlake feels that there should be a lot more research about, you know, how did that turn out? You know, did it really save energy to put in those solar panels? You know, so a lot of their work is on collecting data about the function of their buildings in order to learn from that data So when they design the next building, they can incorporate that knowledge. And so as a result of this, they've, they love these tech toys, and they were finally able to buy an old beer bottling plant where they have tons and tons of space. And they set up all these workshops. They have a workshop where they make sensors that measure temperature and humidity and other data points, and they've distributed them around the office to see, how the air is flowing through the building, what temperature it is in different parts of the building, and then they analyze that data. They make all sorts of charts and graphs and visualizations. They have all kinds of machines for making large-scale mock-ups and models to, so they can study them in the office before they actually commit to building them on the site. So they've turned the architecture studio into a research lab where, they're trying things out in the office before they inflict them on their clients. I think this phrase came up in one of the keynotes last night. Is their motto is to fail early, and so that means they fail and then they correct the problem, and so combining that kind of thinking with their commitment to using sustainable materials and designing buildings that are appropriate for their climate and use as little energy as possible, has made them quite innovative. And so their office is like a big Petri dish, a big experiment. And it was kind of funny because as Mark said, they made this decision not to have air conditioning, and they have some kind of systems that suck out the hot air and fans, but soon after they opened, things got out of control, and it was like almost 90 degrees in the office, and everyone was complaining about that, and they were kind of embarrassed because they were trying to prove something and they weren't proving it, and so they had to order a lot of water ice for everybody and install more fans, but they ultimately did correct that, and now, it's a generally like an even 80 degrees in the office, and they tell people, if you're too warm, you should, take care of your problem. You should get fans, you should dress more lightly, you should come into the office earlier.
You should work in this building. Let's close with you, Kate. We've come full circle to innovation in the office, which is about really what your swing zone. So maybe you could make an argument for how how design can shape the way we innovate in space. Because as Nikil was saying, maybe we don't need to. I know I work in a Dilbert cubicle. It could not be more horrible. I would love for it to be nicer, but I like to think I'm still creative. So tell me, make the case for what does an innovative office actually look like?
Well, I think that what you just described, this research element, maybe that's what's missing. So what you just described could be applied to the behavior that we're seeing in the office too. The question that was posed about whether or not the pharmaceutical company offices created the thing it was meant to create. Is it about productivity? Is it about creativity? Is it about innovation? I don't know if anybody's really looking at the results because of this, that it gets inflicted on the client as it's being built. But the idea of prototyping, which is a very, very, that's core to product design philosophy in particular, and I know that architects do that, but the scale is legitimately just harder to do that on. But I love this notion of figuring out, from a human-centered point of view, what's the current behavior that the physical spaces are insisting on, and then what is the ideal behavior that we're trying to create, and to prototype spaces that might create that behavior and to do it iteratively.
Well, let me just thank our panel. Fantastic. And now we have some questions from the audience. Please.
So, Mark, thank you for facilitating such an interesting conversation. My question is less about physicality of the workspace and more about equity. You shared very eloquent perspectives on ergonomics and how ergonomics affects behavior in the workplace, hierarchy. You spoke to the concept of transparency, both literal and metaphorical. I'm interested in the group of people who maintain these buildings, who facilitate, who clean. And in every organization I've ever worked in, they tend to be represented by a certain socio-demographic. And whenever we have meetings about how to make the organization a more fun place, a more integrated place, they don't tend to be part of that consultation process. And so I'm interested to know about their agency and how to integrate their perspectives.
I can just give a quick example just of the Richards Group building. I mean, this is maybe one small example, and hopefully will answer your question. He made a very deliberate effort to put even service spaces to the exterior of the building. You weren't cloistered away in a mail room in sort of the dungeon of the building. He made a very clear attempt that anyone working in that building, day or night, should have the same experience that everyone else has. So there was never really hierarchical, a forgetting about the other people who were helping support the building. So I think that in terms of setting a quality bar, he set the bar and expected everyone who inhabited that building to experience that level of quality. And that's, one step, but I think it's a big step. Because when you go there and you go to a copy room, or you go to the mail room and you're right there at the exterior glass, which would typically have been a prime law office, is now something that's given over to everyone who has access to the building.
To me, I think I'm sorry, but to me, we talked about mobility and accessibility, and I think when we're talking about that population, I think that is the most critical thing. I mean, we can consult on, it'd be nice to have them consulted on if there's a janitor, how is the janitor's life going to be easiest in the building, and I think that actually happens sometimes, but really the issue is, where are these new offices going to be? How is that worker getting to and from the office? I think that is the crucial question. How do we get that employment to actually happen in a way that's just?
And I just want to add, I think this is such a brilliant question, and you've hit on something that it's forgotten a little bit. I have a memory of working in a hospital, and around some things that were definitely related to the physical environment. And we interviewed somebody who was an orderly, and he cried in the interview, and he said, "No one's ever asked my opinion." But these people know more about our buildings than we do, and they know different things about our buildings than we do. So I love the notion of including their experience, but also their expertise about the buildings that we're working in as we create better buildings.
Great. Next question.
I think it's her turn. There's some of us over here, too.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Kate, your notion of human-centered design, I think, applies to what Ron was talking about, the notion of designing from the outside in, and thinking about that and thinking about the presence of high-rise buildings and these hermetically glass-sealed buildings that we have. When we think about the resilience of our city and how we respond to the stresses and the strains that we face, if we have truly resilient buildings in a truly resilient city, I think we'll start to see that we can't have that kind of building anymore, which starts to answer the question of what can buildings be? How can we address the climate response with our clients? Because, as you say, you start to put sunshades on and it's a cost issue and you have to take those off. But if we have the ability to have operable windows, then when the power goes out, everyone in the building won't fry to 110 degrees. We're going to have to start to address these things, and I don't know if it's a city requirement or if we start to be able to explain to our clients that we can't live in our buildings anymore if we just do these basic boxes. I don't know, what are your thoughts on how we proceed with that?
Yeah, from my experience, it's always a value statement to the client. If we can show value, just like LEED buildings, when the LEED checklist first came out, Microsoft would not lease a space that was not LEED certified or higher. That just puts certain pressure on building owners. At this point, we have to take a look at what the value is on these sustainable efforts. Talk about being resilient. Again, you have a workforce who is going to be very, very smart about where they're working and how they're working. And I think that's the one thing we have to look at is who's coming up next, what are their, what are their proclivities, their interests, the way they live. And what I've seen, we have a healthy materials website. We do not allow toxins in the materials we build with. We saw data that showed that like a newborn baby had 280 toxins in the cord blood. So because of building, environmental issues, we were poisoning babies before they were born. And so we've made a point of making extremely healthy buildings. I would like to think that design can help you live longer in that respect. And we've seen that from even the healthy city, where it depends where you live, how long your expectancy will be. So if we can start to be very, very smart, very robust about showing the payback, and then also being able to shop, a certain building type and a level of quality and almost a cleanliness of the building to potential tenants, that will drive things way up. I mean, we've inspired one developer to do a building like a campus like this in Nashville. I think it's called One Development. But he's making it completely sustainable, and it's just he's able to even command higher rates simply because it's a healthier, cleaner building. And that's when you start to turn the equation around and say, this is good for your business, not just good for the experience of your people.
Maybe we have time for one last super fast question.
Okay, I'll make it quick. I'm a former teacher, and in the last few decades, new ideas have emerged in education, new ideas about learning. Project-based learning, experiential learning, technologies have changed. Talk about schools and learning places and how you see their design responding to some of these new ideas in learning.
I'll take it. I think that this is one of those situations where we're seeing, as you say, some really new and exciting ideas about how we learn, and we don't really have the spaces that support that. So an example, and I want to say due respect to the institution that I work in, but I will use that as an example. We have a campus. The campus has been there for many, many years. Let's take, for example, the notion of project-based learning or a collaborative environment where students are working on teams. Most of the classrooms in my environment are not unlike this. The scale is really different, but the furniture is bolted to the floor. I am the notion of me as sort of the person at the front of the room that will fill the vessels of with the knowledge. The physical space reflects some really old values that are changing, and the values are changing faster than the space can change. So I think it is a legitimate question. What I love about it, though, is that it's not that expensive. It isn't that we need new buildings, it's that we need new furniture. I mean, the scale of it is not significant, and I think we're using maybe a little bit the idea of buildings as an excuse for not evolving quick enough, the things we now know. So for example, we ripped out a computer lab in the engineering school, and now many instructors are using that as a flexible space with tables that move around and chairs that move around and things that stack up in a corner, because we didn't need the computer lab anymore because everybody has a computer, but also because we really are evolving the way that we want to guide learning. I don't know as much about how that takes place in K through 12, but I hear some really similar stories, and I think some of the new schools are reflecting these new pedagogies, but we're a little bit trapped. And this is such a good example of how physical space can impact behavior.
Well, thank you very much for being here. Red lights are going off all over the place. I hope we're not going to explode. The book nerds from the Literary City are next, so I hope you'll stay around for them. You can also sign up for the action phase on Pulse M. I have no idea what that is. So thank you for being with us. Festival wrap-up session is in the music hall at 5:30, and you'll have big ideas from all the different festival verticals. And we'll see you soon.